after the tone.
Hello, this is a message for Sybil Dreeder-Owen or Barbara Hatchie. My name's Tom Tanner. I'm a journalist just trying to get in touch. I wanted to have a quick chat, if it was possible, about Walter Joslin's will. Walter Joslin, he was a retired civil servant living in Hampstead, very well educated Cambridge man. Everyone thought, had left a will half to the church and half to his nephew. And then out of the woodwork, within weeks of him dying, this woman called Sybil Dreeder-Owen produced what seemed like a scrap of a will, really, just witnessed by two people in an art shop in Hampstead within a few hundred yards of where Walter Joslin lived. And in it, Walter Joslin made Sybil his executrix and left all his worldly possessions. People thought it would probably total about 400,000, including his nice house in Hampstead, to Barbara, Sybil's daughter.
The doctor said it was old age that he died from, but had I known the facts, I would have certainly asked for a post-mortem before he was cremated. The last time I physically saw my uncle was when I came down to his wife's funeral, which was a couple of years previously, but we did actually keep in touch via telephone, certainly once a week to make sure everything was all right. Him because of his age. I was notified that he died by his solicitor. The funeral arrangements were made. We went down and attended the funeral on the Friday. I went back on the following day, which was Saturday. I removed various bits and pieces from the house. By arrangement, it was all cut and dried and agreed that we could actually take the items away with us. Approximately a week later, we were then contacted to say that there was a problem with the will, and as far as another one with a later date from Dreeder-Owen had surfaced.
It was a manuscript will with what appeared to be Mr. Joslin's signature on it, although the rest of it could well have been in a different handwriting. I was consulted by St Mary's Church on behalf of the church and Mr Ainley too, to advise whether there was anything could be done on behalf of the church to try to overcome what appeared to be a very difficult situation, because everyone at the church, and Mr Ainley too, felt very strongly that this will, the manuscript will, which had been produced by Mrs. Dreeder-Owen, did not reflect Mr. Joslin's true intentions.
If he'd fallen out with me, he would have possibly cut me out of the will, but he wouldn't have cut the church out. Or vice versa, he'd fallen out with the church, he'd have cut them out and left me in. But to cut both of you out and give it all to somebody else, which is virtually a total stranger, which has been on the scene probably 18 months, he's very, very much out of character.
Well, the question I'm left asking myself is why a man like Walter Joslin, an elderly retired civil servant who devoted his life to his local church, had expressed a previous desire to leave half his money to a church and the other half to his only relative. Why would he then turn everything on its head and leave all his worldly goods to an acquaintance, someone he'd known a short period of time, this funny little old couple, Sybil and Barbara? Why on earth would he want them to benefit from his will?
Well, he was a very, very faithful worshipper here. Virtually right up to the very end, he would be here supporting, not just with his presence, but he was a great supporter financially as well. And in fact, the week before he died, he said to me, here's some money for the Sunday school. I'm very, very interested in the work, of the children. So he very, very kindly passed over some money for the Sunday school, for the work of the Sunday school. And also he said, if you know of any newly marrieds, who would like, financial support, then just do let me know.
All right. So I mean, did you know about his will before he died?
The only thing I knew was after the funeral, his solicitor, Mr. Pinks, got in touch with me and said, oh, by the way, you know, I ought to let you know that the church has been left half in his will. But then, 10 days after that, we learnt of this handwritten will.
Right.
And for someone to produce this 10 days, you know, after the funeral, as it were, I thought this was very, very surprising. So I thought, and I had a word with my church wardens and a solicitor friend and said, look, you know, this has come to light. What do you think about it? Ought we to do something about it? And I felt, you know, from the sort of moral ground that we should perhaps, you know, pursue this and look into it further.
Walter Joslin always consulted a lawyer over any legal matter. When his wife died, he made out a new will through his solicitor in favour of the church and his nephew. So why this scrappy amateur will? What did Sybil do for Walter that caused him to change the habits of a lifetime? What kind of a man was Walter?
The thing I would single out first and foremost was his intelligence, I think. He was a very bright man, very interested, very witty. But above all, a man of great integrity, very precise in his dealings.
So when did this other woman, Sybil Dreeder, when did she first turn up? When were you first aware about her?
Well, after Mr. Joslin's wife died, he told me he had this woman he'd met who said she was a writer like him and she was coming to coffee. And I wasn't to be worried. She looked like a red, muffled up pillar box. And
is that how you described her or he described her?
No, how he described her. And when I saw her, I knew exactly what he meant. She had a red coat and a muffler on, and she looked like a walking pillar box. And he gave her coffee, and he offered her a biscuit, and she put the whole packet in her handbag. He related this to me later in the day.
Yeah.
And he was amused. I was immediately a bit worried.
I remember an occasion when he said to me that he had always assumed that they had not, I think his words would be, two halfpennies to rub together, because that was how they presented themselves. But in fact, he discovered that they had supposedly means. He told me that they had their house in Hampstead and one down on the south coast. They appeared not to work. And one of them spent quite a lot of time in Switzerland. And he was rather surprised that they were, after all, women of means, as it appeared to be.
Yes.
The next occasion, we talked about her and the daughter. He then talked about them on this next occasion as a couple, and he said the Dotty Two. And we were walking up the road together, and he was going up, he said, to Waterston's bookshop, and he was going to meet the Dotty Two there, because Dreeder Owen wanted him to sign a book. And then there was another occasion when he went to tea with them.
Right.
And they took a photograph of him, not in their house, but outside the house, the railings of New End Hospital.
I carefully laid the will out on the table. If you put a photograph which was found in the house of him and her together, he would actually sit directly above the signature on the piece of the paper. Now, that falls into exactly what I thought originally, that the photograph had been put on top of the paper and he'd signed it underneath as who it was in the photograph, and then somebody very carefully filled in the details afterwards around it, which obviously is very, very hard to prove otherwise.
Well, this is the very will that is called into question. Looking at it, it's a flimsy piece of paper. The actual body of the will, which amounts to, what, about 7 lines, fails to actually mention the name of Walter Joslin. His name only appears right at the end when he signs it. I mean, I think it's customary normally to say, I, and in his case, Walter Joslin. But here it just says, this is my last will and testament. No mention of his name. And goes on to say he's appointing Sybil Dreeder Owen and that everything he has will go to Barbara Hatchie, Sybil's daughter, signed on the 15th of July 1991 by Walter Joslin. Now, that stands up in law.
To make a legal will, Section 9 of the Wills Act has to be complied with, and Section 9, as it's been amended by Section 17 of the Administration of Justice Act, requires the will to be in writing, signed by the testator or by another person at the request of the testator. He has to intend to be making a will by that signature which he puts at the end of the document. And the signature has got to be made in the presence of two witnesses who then sign and attest the will. It is not required for a testator or testatrix to tell those witnesses that they are witnessing a will. What he or she has to tell the witnesses is that they are witnessing the signature. Now, if one is looking at that alone and saying to oneself, is that a provision which would preclude the fraudulent? The answer is clearly it isn't.
Amongst all the documents that go with the famous will is this particularly interesting one, signed by one of the witnesses to the will, Emma Williams, and in it she says, "I, Emma Williams, swear I witnessed the late Walter Joslin write his signature on the will dated 15 July 1991. I then witnessed Andrew Scott Stokes write his signature. We were all together during the writing of the signatures, watching each other."
Sybil and Walter came into the shop. He took out a pile of papers out of his pocket, proceeded to take out his pen and write the will. He gave us the piece of paper, we looked at it, signed our names and addresses to say that we were there when he wrote it and everything. He took it back, and that was it. They hung around for another sort of 10 minutes, chatting, friendly as they usually were. Mr. Joslin was sort of very quiet, and in the background it was more Sybil. She was always the centre of attention. And then they left, and that was the last I heard of it until he actually died, and then all the trouble started.
The story is that Dreda Owing said that she took him to the art shop on the 15th of July, which was a Monday. Now, I was away on holiday that week. And when I came back on Sunday, he called me into the garden and said, I went to the art shop with the Dotty too, because they've taken up watercolour painting and they couldn't afford to buy an easel. They wanted me to advise them on materials. That's the reason he'd gone to the art shop.
Right.
And he told me this. Now,
He didn't tell you anything about signing anything? Or...
No, and it's totally out of character for Mr. Joslin. I will never believe a man of his character is inconsistent. He was a civil servant, he had no BE, he was very intelligent. There was a respectable solicitor's firm next door but one to this art shop, which was a newcomer to Hampstead. If there had been any legal matter, he, as a civil servant...
He would have gone to the solicitor?
He would have gone to the solicitor next door but one.
When he was doing what he was doing, it wasn't quite clear as to whether he was giving us the paper he'd just written or what. You know, it was all shuffling and Sybil was the centre of attention, like I said. So we're focusing on this little old lady who demands your attention all the time. But he was there, being quiet, doing his thing, signing, writing whatever he's writing, handing it to us. It didn't seem wrong at the time, but after all the troubles occurred, I sort of thought back and thinking about it, and yeah, it was odd. It was odd that he was so quiet. That was what was so strange.
Sybil and Walter. Walter and Sybil. Strange couple. Maybe he did love her.
Oh no, definitely not. They were mere acquaintances. But she said there was, and produced this Valentine poem that he was meant to have written. And it's awfully crash. It starts Sybil, 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 whichever way you spell it. The name is forever sweet, as is the face that owns it, the mouth, the head, the feet. I don't think I can read you anymore, but the last verse, the last verse ends, and all I have is yours, and all you has is mine. And I'm your dear, dear Walter, and you are my Valentine. Well, he was a Cambridge graduate. He wouldn't have made a grammatical error like that.
I would not say by the way they were together that they were in love, but they did hold hands. So there was something between them. Whether she was holding his hand, you know, I'm holding his hand, or whether they were holding hands together, God knows. You couldn't tell. But they held hands.
I think one of the last conversations I had with him, when he again referred to them, and he said, they're not as daft as I thought they were. And he said this with a sort of grimness. And I held back, not wanting to intrude, but waiting for him to add to this. And maybe he held back, waiting for me to say, oh, why do you think that? And so the conversation got no further. But it stuck in my mind.
So the Dotty two weren't so dotty after all. But if Sybil was Walter's legally appointed executrix, why didn't Sybil make the funeral arrangements? Sybil and Barbara, the executrix and the sole beneficiary of Walter Joslin's will, they didn't even bother to attend the old boy's funeral. The Dotty two waited until the funeral was over. Then up popped Sybil, waving the handwritten will. Peter Ainley was about to lose his uncle's legacy.
Unfortunately, we had to settle the case out of court. We were having to pay for our own costs, and Dreda Owen was on legal aid. It was just the financial side that forced us into a corner. We had no option but to actually agree to let her take the will. It was just becoming impossible to actually carry on and continue paying out on the off chance that we might not win the case when it went to court.
Shortly after the case was settled and the order confirming the settlement was drawn up, I was contacted by a journalist who informed me that he was writing an article about Mrs. Dreda Owen, and he wanted some information about her, from my point of view, in relation to the late Mr. Joslin's estate. I gave him the information, and he in turn provided me with a lot more information that he'd dug up from various previous newspaper reports, from which it was quite clear that she had been involved in similar ventures in the past.
There was sex, there was money, there was death, and there was mystery. I mean, probably the only thing missing for a good story was a royal. I mean, there was everything else there, everything. Blonde on Telephone Vanishes by the Daily Sketch Crime Squad, 1955. Mrs. Sybil Owen, 36-year-old blonde concert pianist whose help 3 detectives are seeking in the Lonely Men marriage riddle, phoned Scotland Yard yesterday. Excitedly, she spoke to Detective Superintendent Bert Sparks from a call box in central London. He talked to her till a police car could be summoned, but before it could reach her, she put down the receiver and vanished. If we go back to 1970, she befriended, I think that's probably the best word to use, the Reverend Casper, and from him, from his will, managed to claim in today's terms 100,000. Then a couple of years later, the writer LP Hartley, who was a well-known homosexual, she claimed that he'd fathered her child, challenged his will, actually unsuccessfully in that case, but nevertheless she tried her hand there. And then in the 80s, Bodkin Adams, she got 53,000 out of him. I mean, it's very apparent if you look back that there is a pattern of behaviour here. This old woman befriending elderly men. talked to about Sybil described her as this dotty old woman, but I wanted to know what she was like in the old days, before she started befriending lonely old men. In 1938, Sybil married Arthur Owen, the assistant bursar at Balliol College, Oxford. They lived in the Oxfordshire village of Gossington, where their daughter Barbara was born. When Arthur died in 1973, his will, handwritten on a scrap of paper and witnessed by Sybil, left everything to Barbara. Strangely, Walter Joslin's will, made 18 years later, was in exactly the same format as Arthur Owen's will. Arthur Owen was well known in the village. He was secretary of Garsington Sports Club and enjoyed a beer in the local pub. Would you say that Sybil and Arthur lived as man and wife, or were there sort of things?
No, they were very much apart when they were living here, yeah. Because Arthur had a room, the back bedroom, and that was... But being at college, you see, he used to have most of his meals at college, and she didn't used to do a lot for Arthur, really.
And did she keep herself to herself in her room and things like that?
Yeah, quite a lot, yeah. She had a Yale lock on the bedroom.
On the bedroom?
Yeah.
What did you make of that?
Oh, I don't know whether it was to keep herself in private or to keep Arthur out.
She wouldn't let many people in her house. You would go there with the bread basket and you would see the curtains go, and there's in other words, oh yes, I know that's John or that's so-and-so, and you would be able to go in and put the bread in and do whatever. But if she didn't know who was going into the house, she wouldn't basically be there. She wouldn't answer the door or anything.
So there was always a bit of mystery about them?
Yeah, because they used to come and go, and they'd be gone for 2 or 3 weeks and then reappear again. They did. And
this car would arrive mysteriously late at night, and it would be one of these blacked out screen limousine type things, and these two would go into the house in the early hours and chauffeur driven, etc.
They was more like sisters, and they was mother and daughter. The antics they used to get up to things and that. I went round there one Sunday to collect the paper money, and there was all this water coming out from under the door and that, and they was screaming and laughing, and I could just see through the curtains that they was chucking water over each other with no clothes on, they was, and that.
What did you make of that?
Oh, being kids, we used to try and creep round and see what we could see any other time we used to.
But you must have thought they were a bit of a strange couple.
We did, yeah. We thought they was... We thought they was from up the London way type thing, because they always disappearing. They was from the house and then coming back again days later, they did. And, you know, we always thought they was weird.
The most ironic story, which involves Sybil Dreeder Owen, is her involvement with Bodkin Adams, infamous man. One of his patients died mysteriously, and he was actually charged with her murder. He had stood to gain from her will. The case came to trial, and he was acquitted. Shortly after that, he got to know Sybil. And when he died in the 1980s, Sybil appeared with a will, witnessed by 2 hotel porters. He'd left £500,000, but her plan didn't quite come off. Bodkin Adams was a man who made many wills, and there was at least one which superseded the one that Sybil hoped to benefit from. And try as she might, she didn't succeed in full, though it's being the 1980s, she was successful in getting £53,000, which certainly in those days, and still today, is a substantial sum of money, and I'm sure while she may have wanted more, she would have been happy with her return. Sybil was still living in Gossington in the early 1970s when she latched on to the 90-year-old Reverend Casper. When 2 delivery men arrived in Gossington with the Reverend's new electric oven, they were greeted by Sybil.
We were delivering a cooker into a Reverend gentleman in Southend in Gossington, and we were let in by a woman who either told us or we by her mannerisms, believed she was the housekeeper there. She said, when we finished, the Reverend would like to see us. So we finished, went through, and there was an elderly gentleman sat by the bed in his pyjamas at a little writing table. And we were told that he would like us to witness his signature to a will. And the will was laid on the table, folded, and we watched him put his signature to it, and then signed it ourselves to say we'd seen what he'd done. And heard no more about it until, it must have been 20 years ago. I was at work and we had a phone call, and I remember as clear as a bell to this day a shout going across the works. There's a Detective Inspector Aggott of New Scotland Yard on the phone, wants a word with you. I mean, a bit alarming when you get a phone call like that. I spoke with him, and it was to do with the will. Apparently there'd been a will fraud in London which had netted a fraction of $1 million was mentioned, wasn't it? That this particular woman had been involved in. And they were following a trail back of similar occurrences. And it was something along the lines that she befriended elderly gentlemen, got them to alter their will in favour of some sort of animal charity or something, just a small amount. And then afterwards filled in a sort of gap in the middle, which left most of it to her. But they couldn't tell us much more than that.
This is the very will. All it says is, I appoint to the executor and trustee of this my will Sybil Dreeder Owen, and I give Sybil Dreeder Owen all my possessions. There's a nice little touch though. He also says, I give to my gardener the sum £5, and my kitchen table and chairs, also my settee. Lucky gardener didn't do quite as well as Sybil Dreeder Owen.
It was just down here in Heath Street that I met Sybil Dreeder Owen, and it followed a telephone call that she'd made to my home. On my answer phone I picked it up, and it was a telephone call not to me, but to my wife, who in fact died 15 months earlier. And it was a telephone to her and asked her to ring back. I'd never heard of Sybil Dreeder Owen, but I followed the telephone number and rang her back. And she professed distress that my wife had died. She was ringing her and wanted to come over to see me, but said, first of all, I'm too upset to speak. I must gather my thoughts. Phone me back. And in short, I arranged to come over and see her the following afternoon. I took with me my friend and colleague, Sheila Jeffries. We'd arranged to meet outside Cato's art gallery. And I looked down, and there was this sort of diminutive Queen Mother figure standing out there, and I said, well, that must be her. So we went down, met her, and introduced ourselves, and indeed it was. So she took us round the corner into the house around the corner to give us tea, where I had tea and biscuits. I must say that this was not a great gourmet meal, because one of the biscuits had had a bite taken out of it. But Sheila was talking with Babette, who was the daughter, across the room. Long story, complicated story. She'd been in Switzerland with a woman named Anne Schroeder, whom she said was my wife's teacher at school in Solihull, just outside Birmingham, 52 years before. Well, I'd known my wife at school, and I knew some of her teachers, though I'd never heard of Anne Schroeder. I tried to trace this connection. I couldn't. The conversation was confused, and I was frankly bewildered. In fact, I think it's most easily summed up by a note that actually Sheila put in her diary that evening. And perhaps, Sheila, you could read that. It would just sum it all up.
Well, this is just a note which I regularly keep of events of the day. And it says that after lunch, Henry and I went to Hampstead to meet a strange lady, Sybil Dreeder Owen, who has been telephoning Henry with claims to know Sylvia. We met her outside the Cato Gallery and went to her cottage in New End. Her daughter, Babette, was there, and both were completely indecipherable. All a total mystery. Unconnected babble about an 80-year-old person in Switzerland, Anne Schroeder, who last saw Sylvia 52 years ago. Babette was more odd than Sybil, and we didn't see the Swiss schoolboy's son. Henry took tea, I didn't.
We searched back through the archives, right back to 1930 in fact, and there is no record whatsoever of a teacher called Anne Schroeder.
Okay, thanks very much.
She never taught at Malvern Hall School.
I don't know. She could have picked up the name from the obituary notice, though it would not have included my wife's maiden name. She could have followed it to news items and from Who's Who from my career, so I could be identified as what I was, an ex-civil servant. But I didn't follow that through at the time.
Sylvia's maiden name's in Who's Who.
Ah, I'm sorry, yes, Sheila's quite right. Sylvia's maiden name is in Who's Who. And also where we were born, where we were educated. Therefore, QED, she could have followed it backwards from there. How she would do that, I don't know. Whether she did that, I don't know.
James. Where are we? Thomas, Philip. Oh, Henry James. Born 1919. Married Sylvia Mary Bickle. Died 1989. Educated King Edward VI School, Birmingham. And entered the civil service in 1938. Oh, an address and telephone number as well. The novelist LP Hartley famously wrote, "The past is a foreign country, they do things differently there." Well, the past is certainly a mystery where Sybil's concerned. Treacher Owen. Treacher Owen. When LP Hartley died, Sybil produced yet another handwritten will, witnessed by 2 hotel porters, which left his entire estate to her.
It was really a very strange thing. It was shortly after LP Hartley died that this woman came and knocked on the door of his old family home and said that she had assigned a document in which LP Hartley had left her his entire world, really. She brought along with her a child and a priest. While Mrs. Treacher Owen talked to Hartley's sister, the priest took the child for a walk. It was a very dark morning, and they were gone, I suppose, round the grounds for about half an hour. And it started to pour. They arrived back absolutely drenched through. And it was then that the priest said that the will they had brought had been lost. He'd lost it in the garden. She really, as it were, stepped out of the pages of one of Hartley's books. One of his last books, indeed, the very last one was this book. And it's very odd, isn't it, that its whole central theme is about wills.
I just treat her with a contempt, to be quite honest. I think she's a con artist that goes around literally setting up people that she thinks are on their own with literally no relatives or relatives that can't be traced and claim the money.
I came out up front with her. I said, look, Sybil, you know, if this is a scam, let me know at least, because I might be getting myself into trouble legally here by swearing that I saw you do something that didn't happen. You know, what is going on here? Tell me, I'm all right. I won't let you, you know, I won't tell anyone. But you can never pin her down on it. She would go, oh, no, Mr. Justin and I were great friends. You know, we had loved each other for a long time, and the church is just greedy, da-da-da, and go off into a story about her father, the bishop, da-da-da-da-da. So, no, you could never really pin her down on it. And even if she is guilty, she comes across like the sort of person that wouldn't realise that what she's done is wrong. Do you know what I mean? she's innocent in that sense.
Very, very curiously, Walter Joslin actually left 2 wills involving Sybil Dreda Owen. About 7 months prior to the art shop will, Walter and Sybil went to a bookshop, Waterstones, in Hampstead, and following the same pattern as the art shop will, they asked 2 of the shop assistants to sign a will. And in that will, Walter left everything, rather than to Barbara, as in the art shop will, he left everything to Sybil's grandson Dominic, that's Barbara's son.
Sybil came in with this very frail-looking old gentleman who was dressed, like a professor, really, and said, "Oh, Randa, this is Walter's. Walter's going to sign a book." Or something about signing a book. I said, "Well, what do you don't just sign books here. You have to be booked in, have an evening, and all this stuff." And then she said, "Now, first of all, dear, can you get him a stool, please? The old gentleman needs a stool." So I got him a stool, and he sat down. And I went back to doing what I was doing the till and things. She came over with him, and he pulled out a piece of paper from a very thin black plastic thing, holder, whatever. And she said, "Right, he said, she said, will you be witnesses to this will, please?" And he signed his name. And Steve was there, my friend, my sister, the guy I work with, he was there as well. And he said, we were both there, and we said, "Yeah, we'll both be witnesses, all right." So he signed his name, then Steve signed it, and then I signed my name, and that was it.
Since then, I must have learned that Barbara Hatchie was Sybil's daughter, and therefore the beneficiary, Dominic Hatchie, he couldn't be anyone other than her grandson. And that's when I started... I didn't start becoming suspicious then, but I certainly... It just rang some sort of alarm bell, which I was kind of keen to silence, because you don't want to believe these sort of things.
In both the art shop and the bookshop, there's the impression that Walter was subjected to a certain amount of undue influence. The impression of a frail old man being led, being encouraged to sign a piece of paper in slightly uncomfortable, unusual circumstances. Apparently, his eyesight was so bad that without his glasses, he wouldn't have known what he was signing anyway. Did he really know what he was doing?
He didn't speak. He didn't speak. He seemed a very, very frail old man. Just grinned. He seemed to stop me as being extremely frail. And Sybil had to sort of take him around, if you know what I mean. She seemed to be like chaperoning him around. At the time, I thought he was just very old and perhaps a little bit gone. Sybil seemed to have to do everything, sort of take charge of everything. That definitely was what I saw. That she seemed to take over.
Undue influence means the coercion of the testator's free will, namely that the testator was made to draw up a will in a form that he or she would not have done unless that influence had been exerted on them. Now, obviously, if one thinks about it, and in the practical world in which we live, the reality of the situation is that undue influence will always, to my mind, be exerted extremely subtly. It is very unusual, having spoken to professional colleagues, to find the case where someone is standing there with a whip or a gun saying, "You will do or you won't do this, or else." It is a very subtle coercion that is almost always exerted against the testator or testatrix.
She seems to be the sort of character who is a gentle Rottweiler, probably. Once she's got her teeth into someone, she won't let go. Whether it be an elderly gentleman who she's befriended, or whether it be someone who she's got onto her side to witness a will. She tugs people's arms, she pesters them, she phones them constantly, she writes them letters, she tells them how wonderful they are. But as soon as she feels that they may be letting her down, she lets them know that, and in no uncertain terms encourages them, if that's a gentle way of putting it, to keep towing the line.
I went to Spain because I had really had enough. I thought, I wasn't going to hear any more about it, and then I started getting letters from her in the post. Although I gained no money under his will, I have to do the right thing in order to live with my conscience. I know, Randa dear, you feel the same, and your conscience would trouble you if you let Walter Jocelyn, the old gentleman you gave the stool to, completely down. On first reading, it seemed extremely like Sybil, always basically putting her point over and over and over and over, emphatically, and like a little kid, enthusiastically. Very clever. She offered me. She said to me, I'll send you £1,000. I'll send you £1,000. I've already spent £100,000 on this case anyway. And she said she'd send me the airfare. She'd get a cab for me at the airport, put £1,000 for me, and all this, which is completely and utterly mad. It didn't happen. But she, reading, that letter now, annoys me now, because it was emotional blackmail.
Now I feel foolish and as though I've been taken advantage of. And as though, you see what was so clever about her was the way she would take advantage of you at just the wrong moment. She would always impress on you how very important it was that you do it now. It was just so urgent, and you'd be swept along with it. It was extraordinary.
It was always a bit of a hassle, having to do things for her, like phone people up for her and stuff. But in Hampstead, it's not unusual to do this for people. Once a little dotty old lady who needs help. I mean, you feel sorry for her. She's like a vulnerable little old lady. So it's, you do those things for her. And also, well, I don't know why I should say this, but, she said that she'd see that I was all right at the end if I helped her out, So, of course, poor little old lady's being ripped off by the big, powerful church, I felt for her. I thought, I'll be your knight in shining armour, really. I mean, you hear stories in Hampstead of people looking after someone else's budgie and becoming multi-millionaires. So you always hope you're going to get that one.
Didn't offer me anything, just kept giving me diaries all the time and trying to pay for cinnamon toast. Oh, yeah. But no, she didn't offer me anything. She did once try and offer me that she'd leave me in her will. I remember now. I forgot that. Yeah, I thought she was completely being nutty there, Leave me in your will, for God's sake. Yeah, she did say that once.
If a witness has been offered a cash incentive before making their witness statement as to what took place when they attested a will, I would want the court to be well aware of this fact because, as I say, to my mind, I can see no ground upon which an attesting witness should have to be offered any cash inducement to report their version of what in fact took place.
Andrew, yeah? No, it's Tom Tanner who spoke on the phone about... I just wanted to check with you that was the real thing. Is that the one?
Yes, that's it. I remember it well.
Were you promised anything if you did sign it?
At first, no. No, it was purely, I was doing them a favour. After Mr. Jocelyn had died and the troubles all sort of started, Sybil used to sort of promise me a sweetness to sort of make sure I stay on her side and don't become hostile witness.
What do you mean by sweetness?
Well, she told me that when she dies, I would have a lovely little cottage in Hampstead, which was Mr. Jocelyn's cottage that now belongs to her daughter.
Just round the corner from here?
Yeah. Lovely place. See, Sybil made out she was getting all of this. I wasn't aware that it was the daughter, right up until almost the last visit to the solicitors. So yes, she has the nice little cottage in Hampstead.
Despite having inherited Walter's nice little cottage, Barbara Barbara appears not to have moved in.
Hello?
And Sybil, she's gone to ground.
Is that Barbara? Barbara, hello? Can I have a word? I'm just looking into
No, I'm sorry.
a story about your mother, I believe it is, Sybil G. Drone, and the will of Walter Joslin. Can you tell me anything about that? Can you tell me where your mother is now?
I can't comment.
I'm sorry?
I don't know where she is.
You don't know where she
I
is?
can't
Have you spoken to her recently?
I have not seen hide nor hair of Sybil since the case is finished, and my attempts to contact her have failed completely. Either someone answers the phone, they hear my voice, and then it's put down, or letters are not returned, knock on the door, there's someone in, but they don't answer the door, you know.
She has used me. She's used me to get what she wanted. And she used me as saying that I was her dear friend, which is complete and utter lie. And I actually believed, I thought she was just a batty old woman, but she's not. She's very clever, I think.
Although the police were interested in Sybil way back in 1955, the Lonely Men marriage riddle, and again in 1977, when Scotland Yard questioned her for 10 hours about the LP Hartley will, the police were never able to make out a case. And Sybil would go on to meet Bodkin Adams, Walter Joslin, and who knows how many others. Peter Ainley, understandably, feels very bitter about his lost inheritance, and he's asking Scotland Yard to reopen the case and investigate Sybil. Anyone who benefits from a disputed will, the odds-on gamble they are taking is that the best witness, the person who can tell us exactly the story of who they're meant to give their money to and why, is dead. In all these cases, they are unfortunately dead. They can't tell us what really happened.